The last Prince of Persia game released in 2010, so this series has been completely dead for the last decade, and so fans of the character like myself, needless to say, were delighted when they announced that the franchise will be making a return in the form of a remake for Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. I really think that this is going to be a great value. It releases in 4.5 months, January of 2021, with a price tag of $40. And I do think it's a good value for people who loved the game back in 2003 and want an updated experience with this game. And I also think that it will be worth your time and money if you have never experienced Prince of Persia before. I think you almost owe it to yourself to try out this franchise. I know that a lot of my followers and subscribers were either too young when the games came out or they just kind of flew under their radar. But Prince of Persia was the precursor to many games that we know and love today. The Naughty Dog model is essentially carried over from what was introduced with the Prince of Persia games. They really were instrumental in shaping how 3D platforming worked with gameplay. And I recently played the original Sands of Time recently, and even though the graphics do need a major update, which is essentially what they're getting in this game, though there has been some criticism regarding the graphics, which I'll get to in a minute, but the gameplay itself is still actually very smooth, and it does look like they're being very faithful to what that gameplay experience was, which I'm very happy about. The improvements that they are making with the combat sound fantastic, and I think that this will just be the best version of the Sands of Time. It will look the best, it will play the best. So I'm very excited to revisit this world. I think that if you've never experienced the Prince of Persia games before, it should be telling that everyone at Kinda Funny and IGN and pretty much every big news outlet is excited for this game despite the graphical shortcomings, and it's just because it really is an incredible game. This was the talk of the town back in the day. I would put it up there with like Spider-Man 2 in terms of being an influential game for future games. And not only that, it just stands on its own so well. It's a really great self-contained story that feels similar to, something like Arabian Nights. It's kind of an Aladdin-esque tale, and it's really quite charming. Yuri Lowenthal is a great voice actor to portray the prince, and it's kind of a basic story. It probably isn't as complex as a lot of the modern storytelling that we're getting in games. It's nowhere near as complex as something like The Last of Us 2. It's like a very straightforward narrative that doesn't have tons of surprises in regards to something that you wouldn't expect. It doesn't try to subvert your expectations, but it really is just a fun Arabian Nights story with really the best parkour gameplay that I've ever experienced. It's kind of crazy, but the parkour and platforming in Sands of Time, I think, still functions better than many modern attempts, most notably, or at least most recently, one that I can think off the top of my head, Jedi Fallen Order. I feel like the Sands of Time, despite being a game from 2003, has better thought out platforming puzzles and parkour mechanics. The combat left a little bit to be desired, but it does sound like they are improving that as well. And overall, this is just going to be a really fun adventure for me to return to. And once again, if you've just never experienced these games, I just think that for posterity's sake, almost, you kind of owe it to yourself to see what people loved back in 2003. And I think there's a good chance that you'll fall in love with this franchise too. I think that it would be fantastic if this remake did well enough that Ubisoft regained their faith in Prince of Persia and allowed this studio that does seem passionate about this character and this IP to either continue with more remakes or to do sequels or to reboot the franchise into a new game franchise. I don't know what they want to do. But ultimately, there is one big major nitpick that people have been sharing, and it's actually been turning many people off from even wanting to buy the game. And that is the graphical fidelity. People are saying that this game looks horrendous. Now, I think that's a little harsh. I don't think that this game looks great, but I also think it looks fine. It's a very big, major upgrade from the game that released in 2003, and I do think that it retains the art style. I think the game itself looks pretty, though I will concede that the faces don't look great. They don't look as detailed as they could, but I also wouldn't say that no effort was put into improving what this game looked like. I mean, they redid every single performance in the game just so they could get motion capture. So we're going to be seeing Yuri Lowenthal's facial expressions. He was performing all of the scenes. So I think that even if the textures and the models don't look as good as maybe you want them to, I feel like the performances will shine through. And like I mentioned, the art style remains intact, and that's really what was important. That's something that still carries that 2003 game today. Back when I revisited the game recently, I made notice that one thing that I really appreciated was the art style, and it's very charming. And the thing is that even though some of the faces, I guess, don't look quite as good as they could have, the cutscenes are few and far between in this game. 90% of what you're going to be experiencing is parkour and combat, and I feel like this, once again, looks really good for that. I actually think that the textures of the world look really great. I think that the environments themselves look phenomenal, and the character models, I think, will look fine during gameplay. It'll probably just be a little wonky every now and then in cutscenes. I think that it doesn't look too much unlike modern Assassin's Creed games. So even though the graphics could have looked better, even though it's not as as high on quality as the Resident Evil 2 remakes are, or the Final Fantasy VII remake is, I think that it still looks good. Once again, it's still a good update, and the game itself doesn't rely too heavily on the facial animations or anything. Once again, it's mostly parkour and combat. And the cinematics do tell a really compelling story as well. And I actually feel like the art style helps that. Believe it or not, having it look, not photorealistic and making it look a little bit more cartoony is actually a really solid companion to what the story is. I feel like if they tried to make it look like Resident Evil 2, it tonally might not match. Having it look kind of cartoonish really assists the story in its charm and in what it's trying to tell. I really do feel like this is Ubisoft doing a remake on a budget. They're kind of throwing the Prince of Persia fan base a bone and saying, you guys keep saying you want a new Prince of Persia game? Well, how many of you are actually interested in that? So while this game doesn't have the same resources or budget that a game like Assassin's Creed has, I would still recommend purchasing it. It looks very clear to me that this team is passionate about the Prince of Persia character and that they really are trying to bring this game and this franchise back to life. And if this remake does well, I feel that that will actually incentivize Ubisoft to do better remakes in the future. And if Prince of Persia does well and can get back on its feet, who's to say that the same couldn't happen with Splinter Cell, which is probably the second runner-up for series that Ubisoft has killed off that people want revived. We could perhaps see a remake of a Splinter Cell game to see if that game still has selling potential. And once again, with Prince of Persia, I think that it could relaunch this series. And with modern games from studios like Naughty Dog, I just think that the potential for games like Splinter Cell and Prince of Persia have been proven, but they just have to be proven with these particular intellectual properties. So I really hope that this game does well. I do think it's worth your time. I do think it's worth your money. I think it's telling that Ubisoft knew that this wasn't a $60 price tag. They've marketed it very well, I think. I like that they're not trying to hide the shortcomings of the graphics. They're being very honest about what this is. It's just an updated version of the 2003 game. They're not doing anything crazy. It's pretty much just a update with the graphics of the game. They're making minor adjustments to the gameplay. They are redoing the performances so that they can do motion capture. This isn't a crazy overhaul, which they could have done. And for many people, that's probably what they would have preferred, is a full-on remake that is not trying to pay homage necessarily to the original, or at the very least isn't trying to replicate the original, but is instead trying to be something of a new experience. I personally think that this is a very smart choice for Ubisoft because they are taking the most beloved Prince of Persia game, updating it, and even though, sure, the facial animations could look better, the character models could look a little bit better, I think that the environments, which are 90% of what you're looking at, look great. NPCs, I don't want to spoil the game if you haven't played it, but NPCs are few and far between. Like, most of the game will be you looking at the Prince of Persia's back as he does parkour around the environment. So I don't think that the graphics are going to be a huge issue. And outside of the graphics, everything about this game is fantastic. And I can tell you that, and I can promise that because I've played the game. I played it back in 2003. It's a game I still revisit. And so having this updated version will be really great. I'll just end this video by reiterating that I do think that this game is worth a purchase, especially if you've never played it before. And even if you have, I think that this will be a great update to revisit the game with. So thanks you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I'm very excited to play this game. I'll be giving you guys a review when it does release. and we'll see you guys in the next one.